How do you apologize for leaving a gathering early? You may say, I hate to eat and run, but... How do you indicate that you don't know or understand something? You may say, I have no clue. How do you express feeling extremely tired or lacking vitality? You may say, I have no energy. How do you admit that you don't know the answer to a question? You may say, I have no idea. How do you express that you are very busy and can't accommodate another task? You may say, I have no time. How do you inform others that you need to leave immediately? You may say, I have to go now. How do you express that you're not familiar with a person? You may say, I hardly know him. What do you say when you're impatient and want someone to hurry up? You may say, I haven't got all day. How do you express your full understanding and acknowledgement of someone's point? You may say, I hear you loud and clear. How do you start a sentence when you've just thought of an idea? You may say, I know what.
How do you express your great liking for something? You may say, I love it. How do you announce your successful arrival or completion of a task? You may say, I made it. How do you stress the sincerity of your words? You may say, I mean it. How do you express the urgency of needing something done as soon as possible? You may say, I need it yesterday. How do you acknowledge that you are indebted to someone for their help? You may say, I owe you one. How do you acknowledge that you understand what someone has said? You may say, I see. How would you express continuing affection towards someone despite circumstances? You may say, I still love you. How do you strongly assert the truthfulness of your statement? You may say, I swear to God. How do you explain acquiring a skill or knowledge without formal instruction? You may say, I taught myself. How do you express that a favorable outcome was due to chance rather than skill? You may say, I was lucky. How do you indicate receiving information from someone else? You may say, I was told that. How do you assure someone you will contact them later? You may say, I will be in touch. How do you express your willingness to perform a task for someone else? You may say, I will do it for you. What do you say when you want to make a toast in agreement with a sentiment? You may say, I will drink to that. How do you assure someone you will obtain a certain item? You may say, I will get it. What do you say to someone you care about when they're about to leave for a long time? You may say, I will miss you. How do you express the impossibility of arriving at a scheduled time? You may say, I will never make it on time. How do you subtly express your acceptance or desire for something offered? You may say, I wouldn't say no. What do you say when you're about to join someone? You may say, I'm coming. How would you convey that a person is merely a representative of an institution and doesn't have personal significance? You may say, in a sense, he is nothing but a suit. How do you express amazement or disbelief at something extraordinary? You may say, incredible. How do you ask if there is anything else, often after someone has given you a list or explained something? You may say, is that all? How do you describe a slightly cold temperature? You may say, it is chilly. How do you describe a condition where the air is moist and warm? You may say, it is humid. How do you describe uncomfortably warm and humid weather? You may say, it is muggy. How do you describe something that is no longer fashionable? You may say, it is out of style. How do you express experiencing physical or emotional distress? You may say, it is painful for me. How do you announce that it's the appropriate time to eat the midday meal? You may say, it is time for lunch. How do you indicate that it's the right moment to leave a place? You may say, it is time to go. How do you describe conditions when there is a strong breeze? You may say, it is windy. When might you say something is logical? You may say, it makes sense. What would you say about a slow process? You may say, it takes time. How do you tell someone you have something for them? You may say, it's for you. How would you express that something is unjust? You may say, it's not fair. What's another way to say something is not fair? You may say, it's unfair. How do you reassure someone? You may say, it's all right. How do you blame someone entirely? You may say, it's all your fault. What do you say when you see something stunning? You may say, it's beautiful. How do you show approval or interest? You may say, it's cool. How do you tell someone they don't have to pay? You may say, it's free.
What do you say when it's very cold? You may say, it's freezing. How do you admit a mistake? You may say, it's my fault. How do you respond to thanks? You may say, it's my pleasure. What do you say when it's your opportunity? You may say, it's my turn. How do you deny responsibility? You may say, it's not my fault. How do you stress urgency? You may say, it's now or never. How do you say you will pay for something? You may say, it's on me. How does a business offer something for free? You may say, it's on the house. How do you emphasize that something is not good? You may say, it's really bad. What do you say about a difficult situation? You may say, it's tough.
How do you tell someone it's their opportunity? You may say, it's your turn. How do you ask for a short wait? You may say, just a moment. How do you say something is almost done? You may say, just about. How do you show you were joking? You may say, just kidding. What do you say when browsing without buying? You may say, just looking. How do you ask someone to watch over something, or monitor a situation for you? You may say, keep an eye on this, will you? What do you say to encourage someone? You may say, keep going. How do you say goodbye, but plan to reconnect? You may say, keep in touch. How do you ask for secrecy? You may say, keep it confidential. What do you say when you don't want something shared? You may say, keep it to yourself.
What do you say to continue a search? You may say, keep looking. How do you tell someone to not interfere? You may say, keep out of my way. What do you say when you don't want your change back? You may say, keep the change. How do you uplift someone who's down? You may say, keep your chin up. What do you say to stop annoying behavior? You may say, knock it off. How do you ask about size preference? You may say, large or small. What's a casual way to say, see you later? You may say, later.
What do you say to end work or an activity? You may say, let's call it a day. How do you propose going to a restaurant? You may say, let's eat out. What do you say to focus on the task at hand? You may say, let's get down to business. How do you suggest meeting up in the future? You may say, let's get together sometime. How do you suggest applauding someone? You may say, let's give him a big hand. What do you say to review something again? You may say, let's go over it one more time. What do you say when you're considering options? You may say, let's see. How do you propose sharing payment? You may say, let's split the bill. What do you say when you want to attempt something? You may say, let's try. How do you announce someone's arrival? You may say, look who's here. What do you say to someone who's fortunate? You may say, lucky you. How do you order cooked food thoroughly? You may say, make mine well done. What do you say to double an order? You may say, make that too, please. How do you ask for space to pass through? You may say, make way. How do you make someone feel welcome? You may say, make yourself at home. How do you thank someone for a future favor? You may say, many thanks in advance. What's another way to say thank you? You may say, many thanks. How do you politely ask to break into someone's conversation or activity? You may say, may I interrupt you? What do you say to express doubt? You may say, maybe not. How do you postpone a plan politely? You may say, maybe some other time.